It's like my drum machine broke, so I founded a whole company. I made a whole tool to make drum samples from.
Realistically, we would have probably done it eventually, right?
I'm joined today by none other than the Max Shafer. He is CEO and co-founder at Just for Noise. Max, great to have you today.
Tom, thank you very much for having me as well. I'm honestly quite a big fan of your show so far. As you know, you've had some of my friends on as well, and really enjoy what you're doing and think what you're doing is super cool for the community. So when you asked me to join, I was super happy.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to learning a bit more about your company and jumping into your track selection. So on that point, you run Just for Noise, pretty new startup. Tell us a bit more about what it is and who it's for.
Yeah, so we're about 4 months old now, so we're quite young. And basically what we're building is a suite of sample generation tools, which essentially helps music producer cut the amount of time it takes to go from idea in their head to a sample that they can then use directly in their tracks. Our ethos, I would say, is not only this idea of time saving for music producers, but also the ability for music producers to create sounds that essentially don't exist in the universe, right? So we've built a handful of machine learning models trained around an immense amount of high quality sound data. And through this, what we call neural synthesis, rather than like a typical synthesizer, we call it a neural synthesizer, you're able to generate sounds that are not only high quality and match the description that you give it, but also don't match any of the data that's the models are trained on one for one. So every time you prompt the generation of a new sound, it's kind of unique in that sense, which is also a super interesting part of the product.
Okay, so we'll get to the neural synthesis bit in a second because that's interesting. If we think about how the current landscape looks for producers, you kind of got the classic sample libraries on one side, so you can go to Splice, you can get the sounds you want. Then you have the more generative AI tools like Udio and Suno, etc. Where do you sit within this? Because there's a lot of noise right now about this, and you are Just for Noise. So yeah,
that was a good one.
So explain a bit more where you sit within that landscape.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? I mean, when we tell people, yeah, we're building generative AI music tools, people automatically go, oh, you're like Suno and Udio, and everybody has their
own, like just another one of those, right?
Exactly, and everybody has their super strong opinions about those companies, and so do we, of course. But we kind of see ourselves primarily as a music producer tool, right? We're a neural synthesizer. That's what we like calling ourselves, because we're just another synth that a music producer can leverage in their workflow. And while a music producer is able to generate the sounds via AI, I would say that's kind of not really our boasting point. All we're trying to do is take that search that you would typically do in Splice or other loop platforms and sample libraries and turn it into a generation rather than a search. And that was, I mean, I'll get into the lore a little bit later of how we thought of this idea and stuff like that. But that's kind of the genesis. Like we as music producers and also all of our friends always complain about not only sample searching, but also sample management, right? I mean, there's so much data in the world. If you look at Splice alone, we're talking 8-9 figures of data, right? Of just one-shot samples alone. And we thought solving that search problem is nearly impossible because it takes tagging the entire world internet of sounds. But we realized that generation instead via neural synthesis is a very, very good solution to get from that idea of a search term to a high quality sample that you can actually go ahead and use. We are also only focusing on one-shot samples to begin. The big ones in the AI space are doing song generation from text. A lot of others are doing loop generation or small format generation, but we're focusing only on one-shot samples, which is really interesting for us because one, it kind of, again, pushes us in this direction of developer tools rather than creativity generation or something like that. But we're also able to gather data more easily because of that, and also gather high quality data and produce high quality sounds in the end because we're able to train on higher quality data at higher rates, basically.
Got it. I mean, for me, this almost flips the idea inside out. So when I first came across you, I'm like, okay, this seems like just another version of a sample library that kind of maybe gets me there quicker. But this idea of the synthesis, which when I was looking through the product in more detail, I did actually start to think, okay, this is kind of like a synth. You almost start with a bass and you can tweak stuff. Tell us a bit more about this idea of the neural synthesizer or the neural synthesis.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like the only reason we call it that is because the way the machine learning workflow is built is based off of neural networks, right? So all it is we're essentially creating a network of sounds, like a sound world, you might want to call it. So for example, one of our models is based just on kick drums. And when we trained our models from end to end, we're taking around 10,000 sounds, creating this little universe of it, or a neural network. And then from there, the synthesis process is just picking a point in this three-dimensional or high-dimensional space and turning it into a sound. And that's the process of synthesis via neural networks. And it's a super fascinating process. And what's getting really interesting for us right now is we're thinking of this concept of continuous neural synthesis. So if I say, hey, give me a dark, clicky 808 drum, and I get a few examples from the model, and then I say, oh, this one's really nice, make it darker, or make it clickier, or make it harder, right? So we're right now looking into this idea of continuously modifying sounds via this neural process over time. I think what we're building is going to be the state of art of workflows in the future for all sorts of music production workflows. Whether or not it's coming from us or somebody else, who knows? But for sure, it'll be the future.
I mean, you mentioned the word workflow a few times at the end, and I think that's the key for me when I'm thinking about, okay, how does this fit into a bigger process of creating a track? In your opinion, where does Just for Noise come in as a producer? Is it like, okay, I'm starting a track, I need some inspiration, need some sounds, or is it like, okay, I need to get a specific like snare that fits in with what I've got, or is it a bunch of different things? Let us know what that could look like practically.
Really cool question. I mean, the way people use samples differ from person to person, genre to genre, and also based off of your level as well, whether you're beginner or advanced. The way I would personally use it, and the way we map it out in terms of how a producer could implement this into their workflow, is as you're working on a track and you begin throwing kind of filler sounds into the track to create a basic arrangement and have a concept for a project you're working on. Towards the end, when you get to a point where you say, okay, I really like how this sounds for the most part now, let's kick it up a notch and get better sounds for each of the different elements, right? That means putting post-processing effects on some of your voices, modifying some of your drums and so on. That's the point where we see people saying, okay, I like this preset that I'm using right now in Ableton, but I want something that sounds more like this. Let me go to Just for Noise, quickly type that in, see what it gives me, tinker with that a little bit, and then bring that into my sampler and begin using it. That's kind of the workflow that we see. But it could also work on the front end of the production lifecycle, right? You can say, I want to start a new project and I want to do hardstyle, and I've never done hardstyle before. So let me quickly see what Just for Noise thinks a hardstyle kick sounds like, or a hardstyle hi-hat, and let me play around with that and then use that as inspiration for what direction I take the song in, right? That's also possible. But either way, the key is, however you integrate samples into your workflow, the point is we're trying to save the amount of time it takes to find the one that sounds right for your project. That's kind of our focus.
It's super cool. I guess in a way it's a more advanced search. So like you're saying, like, you know, I want this type of kick. You might go to Splice and you search for it, or you search for a genre and you start going through the loops of the different things that are there. Or you could go straight to Just for Noise or an equivalent and say, okay, give me, you know, an 808, like say a punchy 808 that's bright, or this or that or the other. I think that's a really cool way. Or you could do both. I guess you could start off with like a Splice loop and say, you know what, I wish this was a little bit different here, and you get a one shot to augment that.
Yeah, it's versatile in that sense. And it's interesting when you talk about workflows, and we talk about this being the future for workflows, and thinking about how much production workflows are changing in general. I mean, I'm a bit biased because I'm speaking with so many cool companies doing crazy things. Like, for example, my buddies running things over at Submix, where they're kind of building this collaboration tool for basically an online DAW, but to the point where you can still run your DAW locally and just run all your audio through a collaborative cloud tool. And it's interesting thinking about, in general, what the future of music production workflows will look like with all these different improvements in some of the more technical details, such as mixing and mastering, collaborating with one another, generating sounds and inspiration. For me, it's kind of overwhelming sometimes to think about how much is changing. Like, I'm also a hardware person for the most part, aside from using some samples here and there. So I like to stick to my trusted local no screen type of thing.
You want to be able to like physically get a patch cable and stick it into that slot to make a different sound.
Exactly. I mean, that's for me, but still, it's interesting to see how many new music producers are coming to the game these days, and all of the tools they have readily available, some even free, to already jumpstart their experience of producing music. I think it's super fascinating.
Yeah, and I think workflow is the main key here with most of these tools. I think a lot of the debate is around creativity and are we replacing humans and that kind of thing, which is valid. But I think really when you see it as a tool to help you get from A to B or 0 to 100 is like, what steps along the way can I take to make this quicker or better or, easier, etc. So that's how I think it all fits in.
Yeah.
Final question for me. Do you specialize in any type of genre, or is this for a specific type of producer? How does that look for you?
Good question. So long-term vision, our tools could be used by anybody in any genre, in any location, from any level, right? But we can't start there because then we'll spend our whole lives developing and we'll never get anything done, right? So we are starting with, first off, a focus on electronic music. That's kind of our main market up front. We're also planning to only kind of target German and US users up front, then expanding to the UK and other EU regions, just because that's kind of our homes. So we're more familiar with the lands. We also plan on targeting primarily bedroom producers up front. We kind of have this assumption that advanced producers would still benefit from this, but they're the ones who more likely have a decent system set up already in terms of sample management and sample digging. For sure, they could still save time, but I feel that bedroom producers or beginner producers will benefit the most from the tool in terms of time saving. And they will also be the people who are in general more willing to modify their workflow and play with a tool like ours.
Cool. Well, thanks for taking us through the tool. I think it's like, my personal take is learning more about it. I was more and more impressed at the niche that you found. First off, the one-shot thing versus either generating a whole song or going to a library, and then the kind of tweakability aspect of it, which is, okay, start from a place, and then, as you said, maybe you can generatively or iteratively expand on what you've done and just kind of get to that perfect sound, which may end up being like, 0.1 second sample in your whole tune, right? That maybe it's repeated 100 times, but I think that's really interesting. And then the workflow part of it. So I'm very excited for seeing how this comes together.
Me too.
All right, so let's move on to some of the music that has inspired your tool and inspired the business. And the first track is not even a track, it's a whole damn album, Max. So I think you're the first guest to go for an album as a track, which is kind of cool. And it's a good one. It's from The Tribe. It's People's Instinctive Travels and The Paths of Rhythm. This is from 1990, the seminal album from Tribe Called Quest. Tell us a bit about what this means to you.
First off, sorry to have an aside, but interesting that I'm the first person to pick an album. But I wanted to say in general, I really love this format. I think it's a super cool way to tell your story via songs. So big props to that idea.
Cool.
Yeah, this Tribe album for me and for our company, I would say is super interesting because it's kind of the genesis for both my own personal music taste and also our company's direction in general. Growing up in California in the 90s, after this album came out, I wasn't really exposed to this sort of music so much, I would say, growing up. I mean, hip hop, there was some influence in the late 90s for me, but nothing on this level, I would say. And I still remember the time my friend first showed me this album. Shout out Dennis Sippin and AJ Hislip if you're watching. Thank you very much. I remember listening to it the first time and thinking, what is this? Like, what is going on there from a production level and a lyrical level as well? It kind of just blew me away. And in general, it was also my first introduction to sample-based production. Which again comes into Just for Noise as well. And for me, this introduced me to a lot of the other big influences in my life in hip hop, like Tupac, Biggie, Wu-Tang, Madlib and Doom, The Alchemist, and other producers who in general use samples as a part of their production workflow. So for me, that was just a big inspiration and introduction to a whole world of music that I wasn't really familiar with. I was also at that time more so playing with traditional instruments. I was playing piano, saxophone, trombone, trumpet, all these different instruments. And so learning this whole other world was super interesting for me. And at Just for Noise, we kind of use this album as a reminder or a centering tool, I would say. Like we use it to tell ourselves, what are we doing this for, kind of? Like who are we building this for? And we like to imagine if we would have existed in the late 80s, would Tribe have used a similar tool? Would they have benefited from a similar tool? Right. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, a lot of their sampling done in this album is from, funk and soul records from like the 80s and 70s. But nonetheless, kick sampling and using drums from other platforms or other creators was still a thing around that time. So we like to think if we existed back then, would we have been able to save them time? And it's also interesting looking at this album on the other side of things, because while it has a lot of samples based in it, it's maybe been sampled more than it has used samples, which is also
Yes,
super
yeah.
interesting, right? So also thinking about future workflows, right? For music producers who are trying to sample music, would they be able to benefit from our tool rather than having to dig and grab copyrights to grab, Ali's kick drum used in Can I Kick It or something, So it's, yeah, for us, it's just a super interesting album, and also just a fun one to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack from this album that we go in lots of different directions. When you were talking about aiming just for noise at bedroom producers at the beginning, I immediately thought of Q-Tip and how a lot of the genesis of the album came from him making pause tapes, which I guess in a way you could say that was one of the first consumer level sampling tools, which is just a cassette deck. And I think he probably spent hours and hours pressing pause after every bar of looping something and then going back and doing that and thinking how incredibly manual that process was, but using the tools available, and
Right.
how we've got to a point, and I'm not sure what happened post-production, if they then later resampled stuff into like an MPC or something and looped it in a more, I guess, digital way at the time. But the hours and hours that he would have spent not just doing the actual looping, but practicing. I'm sure if you mess up, you have to rewind the tape, go back to the pause point, re-cue the record or the tape or whatever, and just do it again and again. So it's incredible. The access, I suppose, to the ability to sample, which at that time would have been open to very, very few people, either professional studios or I guess some people might have had an MPC 60 or an SP 1200 at the time. But yeah, just the idea of going from these pause tapes that created one of the most influential hip hop albums of all time to the fact that someone could today say like, hey, give me a kick drum that sounds like X, right? And then in seconds, I guess, get something out of the other end.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, when you think about the craft of sampling in general, and how it's evolved, I think there's a lot of people around these days still producing music who would see what we're doing and say, you're ruining the craft. Back in the day, I was ripping at tapes and I was going through all this manual effort, like crazy lows and crazy frustration, but also crazy amount of gratification when I get it right, to the point where it's, I mean, instant with what we're doing, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole selling point of what we're doing. So it's interesting to think about it from that perspective. But at the same time, you always wonder, if those tools were always available, would people even be complaining about the craft changing, right? I still think that there's a happy middle ground somewhere, right, in music production in general. And like I said, we're not trying to take away from the creative process. We don't want to make it so that you prompt every single aspect of your song, even though technically it's possible, right? But I think that there's a balance to be found in terms of using your creativity and your energy to build something that's important to you, while also automating the parts that to you are less important, which for us is sample digging and sample usage.
It's interesting as well, the balance between what I would call the craft and the end product. So in a way, if you're making music for people, for an audience, and then they like the end result, does it matter if you spent hours and hours creating? I know for certain fans that can be like a plus. Okay, I like the lore behind this album. I love the fact that, Q-Tip spent hours digging in crates or raiding his dad's record collection and doing this. I think it does add to the story around an album. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily make it better or worse to have done that. I think the craft is for the producer. So if you're a producer that just really likes doing a certain thing, cool, do it however you want. You can go hardware only, you can go, full software, you can go AI, this, that, and the other. But also if you're making a product for someone, I'm not sure how many people knew how that record was produced or were thinking so hard about, okay, what's the methodology behind it? They just heard it and it was instantly resonated with them, right? That kind of craft versus product piece, I think, is an interesting one to think through.
Yeah, I mean, in the entire art world, like you could talk about this all day. Like, what do real creators do? How is art perceived valuable and all that stuff, right? It's super interesting. So I won't begin diving too deep into that, but yeah, I think you hit it on the nail on the head. Like, each artist needs to find their own craft and find the methods that they need to use in order to create something that to them is expressing something or another, right? It's also up to them to decide what they want to communicate. But to the people who just hate on something because it's not how they do it, I mean, that's on them, in my opinion.
Yeah.
To put it kindly.
Yeah, there's this certain type of person that, so this is a sidebar in a way, but like in the audiophile community where people care more about the technical specs of like the speaker wire they use and the impedance. It's like, okay, you care about the equipment, but are you really listening to the music? It's that kind of mentality, which I don't like so much. But yeah,
Right.
I think the other bit you mentioned, which is interesting, that I'd like to go into a bit more, is this idea of resampling. So immediately, you listen to Bonita Applebum and then you hear the Fugees, Killing Me Softly, and there's a bunch of stuff that's been sampled off this album and subsequent Tribe albums. And I always love this idea of that recontextualization. For a start, it's taken a bunch of samples from disparate genres, different times, put them on a track, and then someone else listen to that track, say, oh, I'm going to sample this section. So you're almost like layering and layering. You mentioned it kind of connects a bit to the idea of just for noise as well. What's your take on that, and how do you think that continues to evolve into the future?
Yeah, it's a super good point. And it's also like, kind of as another side point, like as you were talking about that, I was realizing that we're talking about hip hop specifically, right? And how hip hop kind of created this idea of using sampling as a tool. And now when you look at the music industry in general, there's not a genre that doesn't touch it for the most part, right? I mean, maybe there's some super niche groups that have this like analog approach to production, of course, but in general, it's kind of everywhere, right? And this idea of resampling to me is super fascinating because as music producers create more and more content, and in general, as more audio data becomes available in the world, you have this concept of, I have the power in my computer to, for a very low price, create any sound imaginable, right? But we still draw ourselves towards these small groups of sounds, whether that's a memorable chorus from a super popular song or a super memorable drum loop, like a breakbeat, right? Which has been maybe one of the most resampled drum sounds in the world, right? So it's really fascinating to me, and I'm trying to dive deeper into like the psychology behind why do we find ourselves always migrating or navigating towards these same sounds rather than exploring this whole undiscovered world of new sounds that haven't been created or have been created but only used once. I think in general, that's kind of what production workflows look like. When I want to describe a kick drum and I want to generate a kick drum, I'm not using completely new words to describe it. I'm using the same words that you would maybe use or somebody else would also use. So we're kind of instilling that mindset in our product to the fact that, yeah, it's kind of hard to interpret natural language when describing a sound, because how I call a clicky 808 is maybe a little different how you would perceive a clicky 808. But still, we're trying to get as close as we can to understanding this language and getting to the point where we can always center around this one universal pool of sounds that music producers tend to navigate to. But it's not an easy task, but it's a fascinating journey, that's for sure.
It is. I'm sure there's some like neuro-linguistic and neuroscientific elements to how this all works, as well as the fact that, like some things are probably just nostalgic, like the amen break or something, like people associate with different things, maybe like drum and bass and jungle or hip hop. Maybe, like you say, you could create a future classic sample through synthesis and that kind of thing. But yeah, I have no idea basically how it all works and why we like this stuff. Okay, cool. So I think we can move on to the second track. And you actually mentioned the idea of sampling becoming more popular and coming into the mainstream. And this is a pretty mainstream track for number 2. So this is Toxic by Britney Spears. Let us know about why this is significant to you.
It's so funny going from Tribe to Britney, and I did it on purpose just because it's funny. But I mean, first things first. Again, I said I was growing up in the '90s, and the song was a banger. Obviously, as a child, I mean, it was a hugely popular song, and music video as well. But the story behind it actually has little to do with the song and more has to do with our company, which is really funny. So my co-founder and I, Henning, along with our full stack engineer, who's now also on board, were previously working at a company together, and we had a hackathon where we had 24 hours to build out an idea for AI and creativity. That was kind of the concept. And we built out this crazy, ridiculous, as a joke, of course, AI takes over humans' creative platform where you don't have to do anything and AI does song generation, remix creation, DJing, and visuals for you. We obviously, within 24 hours, built barely any of it. But our biggest selling point was that you could prompt the remix of a track via style transfer, which has now become a super popular synthesis and neural synthesis mode that a lot of people are looking into, especially when it comes to timbre transfer. When you say, here's a piano, make it sound like a saxophone, right? Which is super cool. But we took this concept in the remixing world. So you can feed a song into this engine and say, make this in this genre or this style, and then it would interpret your text and then create a new song. We took Britney Spears Toxic and made it into like a 90s industrial hardstyle techno track. And honestly, we ended up winning this hackathon, and I think this song is the reason why we did, because it just sounds so good, like such a genuinely great remix.
I want to hear that now.
I'll send it to you after. And maybe there's no copyright there, so you could play it. No, probably not. But it's funny because this was probably a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when we did this hackathon. And this was just us playing around, thinking that there's cool things you can do in the art world and music world specifically. So it was funny how a year and a half later we find ourselves working full time on something that's obviously very different, but within the same world of neural synthesis, as we call it, and music AI, whatever you want to call it. So that's kind of the story of Toxic by Britney Spears.
That's fun. Why did you pick Toxic of all tracks?
So once we were done with all the building, we were probably at that point 13 or 14 hours into the hackathon, and it's like 4 a.m. We're like, at this point, we're like having drinks, like relaxing a little bit. And my co-founder Henning was like, what song should we do? And I was like, Toxic, easy. For some reason, it was just already on the top of my head. We did a few other ones, like old 90s rave stuff in like the style of like American bluegrass, but it didn't hit as hard as industrial techno Toxic. It was a funny experience nonetheless.
It's an interesting choice because, earlier we were talking about the method versus end product thing. And I remember like Toxic coming out as a track at the time, and I didn't know there was a Bollywood sample on it as like the main hook. And this was like when Timbaland was doing more of that kind of sampling of kind of Indian and Middle Eastern stuff. So it was coming on vogue, but it was really disguised as like a pop song that had a sample. And that was like interesting that you picked that because it almost shows that synthesis or the incorporation of sampling into popular music in a way that I don't know. Do most people know there's a sample in there? I'm not sure.
Probably not. I mean, it's not the most famous early 2000s like Middle East or Bollywood sample used in a pop track, but still, I think it's kind of a memeable thing, showing where it came from and showing the music video. But it is super true, and it loops back to what we were saying before, right? I mean, it started off in hip hop and more traditional analog style music production, and then already within 10 years or 15 years, it was everywhere, right? And super accessible at that point as well, which is also super interesting.
Okay, so producer challenge concept for you. Could you recreate Britney Spears' Toxic using just for noise? Or put it another way, if you were to try and do that, how would you start going about that?
That's really funny. I mean, the vocals, no. No shot.
Straight off the bat.
I mean, maybe eventually, but I doubt we're going to get into that. I mean, again, our MO is one-shot samples, right? And you can take you can generate a one-shot sample of a synth, right? And then plug it into a sampler and play chords and melodies and all that stuff. So I would say for the most part, anything is achievable. It's definitely taking much more time at that point, right? As opposed to generating short-term loops or stuff like that. But right now where we are in terms of the development of the product itself is first we're focusing on drum sounds. So we already got the kick drum down, then we're moving over to snares, hi-hats, toms, and so on. And then we plan to move to probably more classical synthesizers and traditional instruments, for example, strings, a 303, and that sort of the direction. Mm-hmm. Then we plan to go deeper into what other directions our users want us to go. But that's definitely for our side a while down the road.
Got it. So I guess the step one would be, okay, I can create the individual drum hits that would probably approximate that type of sound. And then perhaps next you could generate like the bass, like let's give me like a middle C in this, particular like 303 style or whatever. And then you could play that across the keyboard. And then I guess a future thing, if you ever go to that space, would be then, okay, create me a, 4-second Bollywood style string sample or something, and then you could kind of okay, exactly.
But it's so interesting to think about using our tool for the entirety of the song creation process, because obviously it's possible, but I don't really imagine people using it for that way. As I said, I feel like we're much more of a utility than like an end-to-end creative platform or something, right? I mean, it could be interesting to see what that might look like one day. And obviously a lot of other companies are trying to achieve a similar thing in terms of entire song generation or creating entire stems for tracks. But I don't really see us going in that direction. I see us much more as a side tool that a creative person can use to cut down their time in order to focus on their creative aspects of their process.
100%. I think this comes back to the workflow thing. It's probably pretty inefficient to try and create a whole entire track from these one shots. You probably like have 80% of a track there and you're like, okay, I want to tweak this type of sound or, get something in. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we're going to move on to the final track. And actually here is another first. So it's not an album, but it's basically, I want to call it a set, and I'm going to leave you to describe this in more detail because there's a lot going on in this particular video. So just for everyone listening, Max sent me a video. He's in it. It's basically a tiled DJ booth type situation, and I think DJ set doesn't quite do it justice. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Max, to describe this in a bit more detail.
Sure. As I told you, it's kind of like a little selfish promo, but also there's a story behind it. This is me and my partner. We have a DJ name. It's called Kotyk Murkotyk. It's a Ukrainian name. We played this radio show, which is kind of popular in Berlin. It's called Hör, which means listen in German. They record it in like this tiled bathroom looking thing, and everybody jokes that it's a bathroom. And this particular set was what I would call a hybrid set. So half of it is me playing around with this modular synthesizer and a little drum machine, and the other half is my partner playing tracks off CDJs. The reason why I chose this video is because of the drum machine in there. And there's a bit of lore behind this drum machine and just for noise. That drum machine I actually got at the same time I did the hackathon with my company. I had the company buy it for me, actually. Thank you very much for the drum machine. It's super basic Korg Voca beats, but very reliable drum machine. And I was essentially relying on that thing in my production workflow. I started only using that and my modular gear to create. And I was super happy because of that, stopped digging for samples. Because I was always using drum samples in my workflow and I hated it. I hated always going through Splice and buying sample packs and not using 95% of them and then losing them and having to dig and find where my folders are and all that stuff. To be fair, I probably wasn't the most organized person in my folders, so maybe that's on me. But I just hated the process. I wanted to just play around with knobs and forget about everything. I was going through a phase where every single morning I would wake up early and I would jam. And this was kind of my winter Berlin routine to ignore the gray skies and kind of start the day off on a positive light, although sometimes it was frustrating. But there was one day where I turn on all my gear and I go to turn on my drum machine and it just broke for some reason. I don't know. I still don't know why, actually. I haven't gotten it repaired still. And it broke. And that was kind of the day that I realized Just for Noids needs to exist. Because I spent the rest of my 45 minutes that I usually set aside for this just trying to find my samples. I couldn't find my folders again. And I had already deleted my Splice account at that point, and I didn't end up creating anything because I didn't want to use presets. I had already had this idea of Just for Noise before, and I'd already talked with my current co-founder about it a few times, and we liked the idea. We knew there was a pain point out there, but after this experience, for me, it was like, okay, that's it. Let's do it. If I had this right now, I wouldn't have to worry. I could just throw a high quality drum sample there and go on playing with my knobs. So it's just funny how that little drum machine, I would say, kind of kickstarted us to finally just get our hands dirty and start doing it, you know?
I love the severity of the situation. It's like my drum machine broke, so I founded a whole company. I made a whole tool to make my drum samples from.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, we would have probably done it eventually, right? We were talking about it a lot at that point, but more so like, oh, wouldn't this be cool? And oh, we could actually do that. And oh, let's read this research paper and see if it's possible. But this specific day was a day I called him. I was like, dude, meet me at the cafe. Like, we need to talk about this now. Like, let's start doing it, you know?
This is it. So there's a few things to touch on in that. And I want to go back to something you mentioned at the beginning of the session, which was about file management, this kind of concept of keeping stuff organized. So me personally, I hate that idea because usually when you're trying to grab a file or grab a sample, you're in the middle of a creative flow. So you're not going to think, oh, I'm going to rename this, I'm going to put it in this folder. So how does Just for Noise start to address that issue?
It's a really good question. And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to spill all the magic here because we have some really nice ideas. Sample management and MIDI management and overall data management for music producers should be its own product. I mean, I know some cool people building cool things like Audio Cypher, shout out Ezra, building super cool MIDI management stuff. And I think it's a whole other world, but we also have some really nice ideas of how we can kind of improve that, at least for one-shot sample management. Aside from that, in general, I feel that by having a synthesizer, right? A neural synthesizer that can generate one-shot samples for you. You remove the need to have structure, right? I mean, to be fair, you're going to find some samples by interfacing with Just for Noise where you're like, I want to use this every single time and I need to save this. But I have a theory that if you have a neural synthesizer on your side or even a drum machine on your side, you don't need as much clutter. You don't need as much data in order to arrive at something that you think is good enough for your projects and good enough for your own personal sound. Even aside from file management, by using neural synthesizers for one-shot samples, you're able to reduce the amount of samples you need throughout your creative process. That's kind of my mindset, at least.
So I suppose that's kind of the synthesis mindset, which is you've got the tool, so to speak, to create the stuff. You don't necessarily save the samples from it, or obviously you can track it out and stuff. But each time you're coming to it and saying, okay, I want this type of sound and I'm going to make these things happen to create that thing. So it's not like I need 10 versions of that. I just will make it live basically each time.
Exactly. The other little thing, and I'll mention this without going too deep into it, is as you generate a sound with our tool, you're already labeling that sound, right? When I say I want this type of kick drum with these characteristics, it's saved with those characteristics, right? So just planting that on you can think about the different ways in which digging becomes easier when you have tagged data.
Yeah, like searching not just by the type, but by the different characteristics, I suppose,
exactly.
you put on it. When it comes to the neural synthesis part, can it create the same thing twice? Like if I say, oh, I really liked when I made this kick drum, but I want to make it again, would the same prompt make the same thing, or is it going to be like slightly different?
It's a really funny question, and like it's interesting because so many people ask us this question, and I never really thought about it until people started asking it so much. In theory, the way the model is built, you can put this kind of hot and cold range on it. I don't know if you've seen in like some of the chatbots out there, you can decide how wild the responses are based off this hot and cold meter. And you can essentially control the machine learning models that we're building in the same way. So you can set your model to hot, to where every single time you prompt the same exact search, you're going to get something completely different in this realm based off those terms. Or you can set it very cold to the point where you get nearly the exact thing every single time. But in theory, how this neural process works, it's never going to repeat the same exact action every single time. So with the same words, technically, the end result will also be different. Just as if you use an image generator or a video generator and you give it the same prompt, it'll always at least be slightly different, right? It'll maybe still like a Picasso painting or whatever because you said Picasso, but some characteristics are always a little different. And that's the fascinating part about stable diffusion in general, which is one of the pieces in almost all image and audio generated stuff.
You know, I guess the interesting thing about that is almost like coming back to analog, where everything is like slightly different. Like if a temperature is a bit different in the room, it's not stable necessarily. Yeah, that's a little mini revelation I've just had, because the files obviously stay the same every time. But if you're doing slightly different things on the wildcard front, you're going to come up with slightly different results.
Exactly. So we definitely want to find the balance when we talk about file management. We want to find the balance between persisting nice sounds that you generate and you want to keep, while also giving you an option to create iterations of that sound via further prompting. That's kind of our idea.
Cool. Well, Max, it's been great to talk through your stories and your business with you. I've learned a few things, and I'm probably going to go away and research a bit more after this. But before we wrap up, where can people go to find out more about Just for Noise?
Yeah, first off, super fun, Tom. Again, I love the format. Really enjoyed being on the program, so thanks for having me. We will be having an official launch early next year, probably around late winter, early spring, and you can sign up on www.justfornoise.com with the number 4, no periods, no spaces or anything like that, or www.just-noise.com. Tom will shoot the link somewhere for sure as well. And also, as another little side plug, I will be releasing an album early next year, so you can also follow me and Kotyk Murkotyk, who's my partner, to see what music we're putting out.
Awesome. Max, been a pleasure. Great speaking with you.
Right back to you, Tom. Best of luck. Ciao.